好，您讲一句话。
好，请问这样声音可以吗？
声音这样哦，很清楚。
简单介绍一下自己，然后
The company that you run in Taiwan.
好，大家好，我是渔朗观光的总经理，叫做盛智仁。
好，我是阿宽，这个餐厅叫猫下去。
My name's Michael McCreesh, and I'm one of the co-founders of Park Bus Taiwan.
101有办公室租赁，有购物中心，还有加上一个观景台。
My Taiwan Tour 是一间做 inbound 的服务公司。
华旅行社我们应该算属于中高价位，在台湾欧洲旅游市场方面，我们算是一个佼佼者，是领先者。
With the end in sight for Taiwan's travel restrictions, we join key industry leaders to look back at the struggle for survival and forward to the reopened future, now imminent, that they have fought so hard to attain. As COVID restrictions descended around the world, a global tourist industry that had expanded almost without interruption for the previous 50 years was suddenly forced to a standstill. By 2019, the industry was contributing a staggering 10.3% to global GDP, around $9.6 trillion. In 2020, that number more than halved. Of course, Taiwan was no exception. Indeed, its vulnerability perhaps was even greater than most nations, given the overwhelmingly inbound bias of its tourism sector. Beginning with the establishment of the Taiwan Provincial Tourism Commission by the Kuomintang in 1956, Taipei has made a priority of attracting inbound international travelers.
Revitalized Taiwan began efforts to attract tourists around 1954. 10,000 came that year, and by 1971, the annual figure reached 500,000.
By 2000, it was over 1 million. By 2019, a record 11,900,000 international tourists visited the island, a 7.21% increase on the previous year. To many, it felt as though Taiwanese tourism had finally hit its stride.
2019年的时候，应该是台湾观光业者表现最好的一年，然后大家都上看很好的前景。
2020年看到1月份的业绩觉得很开心啦，觉得说今年会是一个很丰收的一年。
And then, in March 2020,
像台湾过往一年1000多万人次的外籍旅客入境，基本上就是全部归零。
对我们这种专门做我们叫做 outbound 出国的一些旅行社来讲，这样的公司突然完全没有生产是一样的。
In April 2020, the number of people arriving in Taiwan for the express purpose of tourism and leisure was 4. Occupancy rates in hotels across the island flatlined to just 15% of the previous year. The share prices of major tourism outfits like hotels and travel agencies collapsed by upwards of 40%. Taiwan's Tourism Bureau estimated total revenue losses for both 2020 and 2021 at over $11 billion.
那时候我听到很多同业其实马上就是公司就裁员，甚至有些公司100-200个裁到剩1个2个东西。
这个酒店过去85%的客人是外国人。你想想看，说哪一个行业你有85%的市场不见了你还能够获利，或者你还能够生存下去的，这个是一个非常困难的一件事情。
因为去年疫情的亏损我们开始把公司尽量缩编。我们以前有60个员工在上班，我们现在大概剩30几个，就是让它缩减。
Yet this gloomy picture contrasts with the sunshine of Taiwan's famously successful pandemic. Certainly, all that sunshine left the nation in fine economic health. Manufacturing conglomerates, including the Goliath Taiwan Semiconductor, posted record-breaking profits, and a combination of the post-pandemic revenge consumption phenomenon with outbound travel restrictions fed a frenzy of expenditure on luxury goods. This might have benefited hybrid businesses.
What's happening with the pandemic? Young Taiwanese are really rediscovering their country, and they've used Park Bus to be able to get to some of those places.
国外的疫情，他们没有办法办展，反而把这些特殊的商品，送到国内，所以反而这些国际精品的业绩是不减反增。
But the explosion of domestic consumption, catalyzed by an open nation with closed borders, did not prove the lifeline for tourism businesses that might be imagined.
大家都会以为观光业者都是一样的啊，你就是做旅游产品啊，就像是一样的料理，你要卖给不一样的人，你的味道都会改变吧。所以他没有办法这么 direct 的去做这样的 switch。
另外一方面是因为我们在意大利也有饭店嘛，所以我们的很多感受跟台湾的同业又有一点不太一样了，因为现在意大利那边已经完全开放。我记得我2个礼拜前跟意大利的同事在开会的时候，他们就跟我半开玩笑讲说，COVID? What COVID?
As in Italy, so in the wider West. By summer 2021, border closures were beginning to feel like a forgotten relic in Europe and the Americas. Re-engagement was also picking up pace right across Asia. First out of the gates was Thailand in July, followed closely by Singapore in September. In March 2022, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations announced that all member states were to reinstate free travel. On the 1st of April, South Korea announced that it will be doing the same. So, by summer 2022, Taiwan had been shuttered for longer than almost any other major economy. Its fellow outlier?
其实我希望政府不用学中国那么保守，旅游业者应该100个有99个说太保守，希望能够开放更快。
For Taipei, the cross-strait comparison was perhaps somewhat uncomfortable. A media darling throughout the early pandemic, Taiwan was now subject to international scrutiny, as its isolation began to look increasingly isolated. With neighboring nations throwing open their doors left and right, it was this last solo leg of the marathon that really caused maximum pain for most tourism businesses in Taiwan.
最黑暗的时刻其实是今年应该说到2021年的时候，我们虽然有封了3个月的时间，但那个时候政府都有提拨预算，帮大家做一些解脱、一些解套嘛。
For unlike Bangkok, Hanoi, or Kuala Lumpur, a strong economy and successful pandemic meant that Taipei could quite literally afford to overlook its tourism industry. Back in March 2020, Taipei had announced a special budget of 1.05 trillion Taiwan dollars to subsidize almost everything from wages to operating costs. 2 years on, there were still no tourists, but now government subsidies had dried up too.
饭店业的补助在2020年的时候还比2021年还多一点这个对我们来讲有一点矛盾了因为整个疫情跟冲击2021年的冲击是比较大的。
过去有补的时候，你还可以保住员工。我们今年这段黑暗期就只好再割爱了一部分的团队。
那去年我们真的有亏损，但也没有亏损到可以拿补助。你后来就是得面对它，然后想办法在去年最后一季，就是在这个时候，你就要把营业额还要把它把 benefit 做回来，把亏损弭平。
补助2成有什么用？你的企业主你还是要付到8成那些东西这是薪水部分而已而且还有其他的，我还有我刚刚讲的我的水电开销的，有些还有房租，还有其他的一些设施东西，这些你没办法补助的东西对不对？你光补助的薪水2成到3成，那一点用都没有。
因为台湾整体的那个经济成长率是不错的所以当你整体数字是不错的时候有时候政府在做决策的时候就会比较忽略了说里面有好跟有不好的，所以我们有一点算是一个被遗忘的行业啦。
Yet, perhaps incredibly, there were few bad words said about Taipei's handling of the pandemic.
我们其实在全世界疫情相对是比较好运的一个国家。
Thankfully, with the great work that Taiwan's government was able to do, we were back up during the summer.
我觉得政府在这方面一直在因应状况做调整，那我们就是非常信任政府的一些措施。
With the final quarantine door in Taiwan having closed on the 12th of October, the industry faces a raft of new challenges. From the systemic.
As the frontline staff, you're kind of put through the ringer a little bit during COVID. For some, they realize, there's other opportunities out there. So the tourism industry is having a real hard time bringing people back into the labor market.
To the specific.
Talking with people about Taiwan, first thing that comes up is how is the situation with China, especially after Russia invaded Ukraine. I can't help but think that is going to be on people's mind when they pick a travel destination.
But the pandemic wasn't entirely doom and gloom. If one theme in particular emerged from these interviews, it was a shared experience of unexpected positivity.
疫情的情况之下，我们在观景台就举办了一个儿童市集，结合了台北市政府还有16个公益团体，大家一起在那边举办活动。
疫情的时候，我们是客人最好的陪伴。常讲妈妈早上起来不知道小朋友要吃什么，打过说，你们有卖什么这样，然后我们就帮他 deliver 一些这样。
We were able to launch ParkBus Taiwan at a time where ParkBus Canada was actually shutting down, and so they looked at us on how to reopen.
在这些辅导演讲的过程当中，你看着这些学生，他们很有动机来上课，大家一起为更好的台湾做成长。
疫情期间，你可以感觉上，其实客人跟你的关系不是只有一个买卖，其实甚至已经是有一些是好朋友。
我们本来跟邻居其实以前不太熟，没有什么互动后来因为这段时间，他们看到怎么军品有一群人每天下午都在这边 打扫环境哈，他们也蛮感动的，然后就送我们饮料啦，送西瓜啦哈，然后就说大家反而变成一个就很好的一个互动关系。
For the survivors of this grueling endurance test, there is of course relief, but also an unmistakable sense of pride at being among the few left standing. Both sentiments fuel a palpable current of optimism as the industry looks towards a reopened future.
剩下的窗口真的不多，所以其实能够活到最后的，一定很有实力，或者是很有 commitment。
Will Taiwan's relationship to the world changed utterly over the past 3 years, both on its own merits and as a symbolic David in a world of increasingly aggressive Goliaths? Let us hope that the wider world has not forgotten Taiwan's tourism industry.
算撑得很，撑过，
撑还活着啦，还活着。